There are essentially 5 main characters in Great Expectations. The first is Pip. Philip Pirrip, or Pip, is the protagonist of Great Expectations. As a boy, he seems unsure of his own self-worth and place in the world. His parents are dead, and he's been raised by his bad-tempered sister, Mrs. Joe, and her husband, a blacksmith named Joe. Mrs. Joe often beats Pip and tells him she wishes he was never born. As a result, Pip has a sense of inferiority. Fortunately, Joe befriends Pip and tries to protect him as much as possible. Because of this, Pip forms a strong bond with the simple, kind Joe and looks forward to being his apprentice. However, Miss Havisham and her adopted daughter Estella trigger Pip's sense of inferiority. Under her influence, Pip comes to view being a blacksmith's apprentice as common. To attain validation as a person, Pip believes he must rise to the upper class, transforming himself to win over Estella, an opportunity granted to him by a mysterious benefactor. Then there's Estella. Estella is the adopted daughter of the recluse, Miss Havisham. She is groomed by Miss Havisham to become an instrument of the jilted recluse's vengeance. Under Miss Havisham's influence, Estella suppresses her natural desire for love and to express it. As a result, her own heart has grown cold. She marries an abusive brute, Bentley Drummel. Miss Havisham is another key character. Miss Havisham comes from a wealthy family that gained a fortune through a brewery. As a young woman, Miss Havisham developed into a proud, headstrong person. She became engaged to a man even though relatives warned her against it. When the man jilted Miss Havisham on her wedding day, he deeply wounded her. Miss Havisham became a recluse for whom time stopped on her wedding day. She lives in a state of frozen time in her home, Satis House, wearing her wedding dress and withering away. Abel Magwitch is another important character. An escaped convict who tells young Pip to get food and a file for him, Magwitch at first appears to be a terrifying hardened criminal who hates another convict named Compasson. An early indication that more lies beneath Magwitch comes when he takes responsibility for stealing food, even though Pip actually stole it for him. Later, Pip learns about Magwitch's hard life growing up in poverty without parents, and then his life as a transported convict in Australia. Magwitch is Pip's secret benefactor, who bankrolls Pip's training to become a gentleman. Then there's Joe Gargery. Joe Gargery is a blacksmith who befriends his wife's younger brother, Pip. Joe is a simple, kind man who accepts his life and wants nothing more. Joe values hard work, honesty, and friendship. He has respect and integrity. Joe acts awkwardly toward Pip after he becomes a gentleman. He eventually marries Biddy, Pip's former friend and tutor, and rekindles his friendship with Pip. In Chapter 1 of Great Expectations, readers meet a boy named Philip Pirrip, nicknamed Pip, as he gazes at the graves of his parents in a church cemetery on a stark marsh near the sea. He's a sweet kid who's had a lot of misfortune dealt to him. Suddenly, a scary-looking man appears in the cemetery and threatens Pip, picking him up, spinning him around, and telling him to keep quiet or he'll cut his throat. The man wears a large iron on his leg. Petrified, Pip pleads for his life. The man asks the boy what his name is and where he lives, and Pip tells him. When the man asks about Pip's mother, Pip explains that his parents are dead and buried in the graveyard, and he lives with his sister and her husband. The man orders Pip to get him a file and food. If Pip fails in this task, the man says his younger companion will find Pip during the night and tear out his heart and liver. Terrified, young Pip swears to comply. In Chapter 2 of Great Expectations, Pip arrives home, where he sees his sister's husband, Joe Gargery, a blacksmith, warming himself by the fire. Pip describes Joe as a gentle, physically strong, dim-witted soul, and the two have formed a close bond that helps them endure the rages, scolding, and beatings of Joe's wife, referred to as Mrs. Joe. Mrs. Joe is Pip's sister. Mrs. Joe bursts into the house, strikes Pip with a stick called the tickler, and throws the boy at Joe. Furious, Mrs. Joe asks where Pip has been, and the boy replies that he was at the churchyard. She complains about having to care for Pip, then prepares tea and gives her brother bread and butter. Concerned about not being able to find food for the convict on the marshes, Pip hides his piece of bread in his trousers. It's Christmas Eve, and Pip stirs the pudding for the next day. Then he hears guns firing in the distance and asks why that's happening. Mrs. Joe explains that the firing warns that a prisoner has escaped from the prison ships, called hulks. Pip goes to bed, terrified about the young companion coming to tear out his heart and liver, and about being sent to prison for stealing food. As dawn breaks, Pip sneaks to the pantry and steals food, including a pork pie and a bottle of brandy. He then removes a file from Joe's blacksmith shop and heads into the marshes to give them to his oppressor. In Chapter 3 of Great Expectations, young Pip carries his handkerchief bundle filled with stolen food and a file into the marsh. Pip comes upon a snoozing man he assumes is the same man he met yesterday. However, when the man turns toward Pip, the boy realizes he's a different man who also wears a leg iron. This man, who has a bruised left cheek, stumbles away into the mist. Pip assumes this is the young companion that he was warned about. At the local battery, Pip finds the man he met the previous day, and he gives that man the food and brandy. The man thanks Pip and devours the food ravenously, like a starving dog. Pip expresses concern that the man won't leave any food for his young companion, and the man at first dismisses it. But when Pip says he saw the young companion, the man becomes surprised and threatens to track him down. Pip slips away as the convict begins using the file on his leg iron. In Chapter 4 of Great Expectations, guests arrive on Christmas Day at Pip's house, including Mr. Wopsle, Uncle Pumblechook, and Mr. and Mrs. Hubble. Mr. Wopsle is a church clerk who considers himself a gifted orator. Uncle Pumblechook is a pompous, middle-aged man, and during the dinner, Pumblechook makes Pip the focal point of a lesson on how boys are similar to swine because they are selfish and ungrateful, which makes Pip feel ashamed. Pip considers his deceitful act of stealing the food, and this causes him to burn with guilt, making it hard to enjoy the gathering. He imagines everyone, including the farm animals, accusing him of being a thief. And during the Christmas dinner, Pip fears his deceitful act will be found out. Meanwhile, Pip worries that the missing food will be discovered during the course of dinner. His fears explode when Mrs. Joe tells her guests she will serve a final course of a savory pork pie. Hearing this, Pip jumps up from the table and runs to the door, only to collide with a party of soldiers. In Chapter 5 of Great Expectations, the sergeant in charge of the soldiers at the door asks Joe if he could repair handcuffs, then explains they are tracking down 2 escaped convicts. Pip feels relief that they have not come for him. The working-class sergeant, Joe, and Mrs. Joe, along with their middle-class Christmas guests, view the capture of the convicts as a game, like an entertaining type of fox hunt. After Joe, who's the town blacksmith, finishes repairing the handcuffs, he proposes to his Christmas guests that they should go along on the hunt for the convicts. Mr. Wopsle agrees, but the other guests decline. Joe, Pip, and Mr. Wopsle follow the soldiers into the marsh. Pip worries that his convict will identify him if they should meet. The soldiers hurry through the marsh, with Mr. Wopsle and Joe carrying Pip on his back, running after them. Moving toward the battery, the soldiers come upon 2 convicts loudly fighting in the mud. The soldiers separate them, and Pip recognizes his convict. The other is the man with the bruised left cheek. Pip's convict expresses satisfaction that he prevented the other convict from escaping. The other convict accuses Pip's convict of trying to murder him. Pip's convict looks at Pip for a moment. Pip lightly shakes his head, trying to convey that he's not an informer, unsure if his convict understands. The soldiers take the 2 prisoners to a hut by the sea, followed by Joe, Pip, and Mr. Wopsle. Unexpectedly, Pip's convict claims he stole the food, including a pork pie, from a blacksmith in a nearby village, thereby letting Pip off the hook. Joe concurs that his wife noticed the pie was missing just as the soldiers arrived. The soldiers place the 2 convicts in a boat, which is then rowed out to a prison hulk. In Chapter 6 of Great Expectations, Pip feels compelled to tell Joe about his theft. But Pip fears that if he comes clean, Joe will always view him with suspicion and distrust. As a result, Pip decides not to reveal the truth. Exhausted, Pip naps in the kitchen. When he awakens, he overhears Joe describing the capture of the convict and Pumblechook theorizing on how the convict committed the theft. Mrs. Joe drags Pip to bed. In Chapter 7 of Great Expectations, Pip becomes Joe's odd boy, one who does odd jobs, and goes to a school where he receives a lousy education, but is helped by an orphan named Biddy, who assists Mr. Wopsel's great aunt. One night at home, Pip shows Joe a letter he wrote, and although his writing has many mistakes, a proud Joe is very impressed by the letter and calls Pip a scholar. Pip asks Joe why he never went to school, and Joe explains that his alcoholic father always got in the way of his schooling. Joe also explains that he married Pip's sister because he was lonely as a single man, and calls her a fine figure of a woman. Joe says he wanted to raise baby Pip with Mrs. Joe, and Pip is touched. Joe agrees to be schooled by Pip, but insists that it be kept a secret. Mrs. Joe and Uncle Pumblechook arrive, and Mrs. Joe relates the surprising news that a woman named Miss Havisham wants Pip to come to her house and play, but no reason is given. Both Pip and Joe are surprised by the news. In Chapter 8 of Great Expectations, Uncle Pumblechook takes Pip to Miss Havisham's house, a dreary house that has an abandoned brewery attached to it. A proud young lady comes to the gate and allows Pip to enter, but rebuffs Pumblechook. The girl, about the same age as Pip, escorts him into the home and tells him the building is called Satis House. The girl leads Pip to the second floor and leaves him in front of a door. Pip knocks. A voice says to enter. Pip finds himself in a dressing room lighted entirely by candles with no sunlight. He sees a strange-looking woman, Miss Havisham, seated by a dressing table, dressed in a yellowing old wedding gown. The disheveled woman looks skeletal with dark, sunken eyes, and when Pip stands before her, he sees that her watch and a clock in the room have both stopped at 20 minutes to 9. Miss Havisham places her hand over her heart and tells Pip that it's broken. She then commands Pip to play for her amusement. Pip says he can't, and Miss Havisham orders Estella, the girl from earlier, to play with Pip, but she says he is a common laboring boy. However, Miss Havisham convinces Estella with the enticement that she can break his heart. As they play cards, with Estella spewing insults about Pip's manners and appearance, Miss Havisham asks Pip what he thinks of Estella. Pip says she is proud and pretty, but insulting, and he would like to go home. After finishing the game, Estella takes Pip out to the yard and leaves him to get some food. When she's gone, Pip cries about feeling insulted and inferior. He enters the brewery and sees what appears to be a woman wearing a faded wedding dress hanging from the neck by a rope attached to a beam. Horrified, Pip runs, but when he looks back, she's gone. Before he leaves, Estella taunts Pip even more. In Chapter 9 of Great Expectations, Pip returns home from Miss Havisham's, and Mrs. Joe and Pumblechook grill the boy about his experience at Satis House. Pip becomes angry at Pumblechook's attempts to get him to reveal details about Miss Havisham. Then, thinking that they wouldn't believe the truth, Pip decides to tell a fantastic lie about his time with Miss Havisham and Estella, one that includes carriage rides and playing with giant flags, all of which is totally made up. Amazed, Pumblechook says he's heard that Miss Havisham is eccentric, and she's certainly reclusive, so he and Mrs. Joe come to accept Pip's story as fact. Mrs. Joe tells Pip's story to Joe, which mortifies the boy. He feels bad about telling a lie to a person he cares about. When Pip and Joe are alone in the forge, Pip tells him his story was a lie. Joe is surprised and upset, and Pip feels guilty. Pip explains how miserable and common he feels. Now, Pip feels the keenest guilt about telling the lie to Joe because he loves the blacksmith. For Pip, the desire to tell the truth comes from the tangible love of a person, not some moral principle. In Chapter 10 of Great Expectations, Pip decides to improve himself in an attempt to become uncommon in Estella's eyes. He asks Biddy to educate him, and she willingly agrees and begins to tutor Pip. One evening, Pip goes to the local tavern to bring Joe home. In the tavern, Pip joins Joe, Mr. Wopsle, and an unusual, secretive stranger near the kitchen fire. The stranger learns what Joe's last name is and buys rum for Joe, Mr. Wopsle, and himself. The stranger also seems intent on uncovering Pip's relation to Joe. When the drinks are served, the stranger uses a file to stir his rum, making sure that only Pip can see this deliberate action. A shocked Pip realizes the file is the same one he stole from Joe. As Joe and Pip are about to leave, the stranger gives Pip a shilling wrapped in paper. When Joe and Pip arrive home, Mrs. Joe discovers the paper used to wrap the shilling is really 2 1-pound notes. In Chapter 11 of Great Expectations, Pip visits Satis' house. Estella takes him to a room where 3 women and a man, revealed to be Miss Havisham's relatives, Mr. and Mrs. Camilla, Georgiana, and Sarah Pocket, are seated, speaking with judgmental airs. Pip refers to the stuffy, uppity group as toadies and humbugs. As Estella leads Pip to Miss Havisham's room, she asks him if he still finds her insulting. Pip replies she isn't as insulting as before, and Estella slaps Pip angrily. On the stairs, Pip meets a burly man who warns the boy to behave himself. Estella leaves Pip in the dressing room with Miss Havisham, who tells Pip to go across the hall. He finds himself in a large, dark, boarded-up room. Pip sees a long table covered by a tablecloth with a centerpiece on it covered in cobwebs. Miss Havisham enters and tells Pip she will be laid on this table when she is dead. Then Miss Havisham points at the centerpiece and says it's her wedding cake. Miss Havisham has Pip lead her around the room, and Estella arrives with the 4 visitors. Miss Havisham acts rudely toward them. Miss Camilla talks about a person named Matthew Pocket and how shameful it is that he doesn't visit Miss Havisham. Miss Havisham exclaims that all the visitors and Matthew will be in this room to view her dead body and feast upon her before ordering them to leave. In the dressing room, as Pip and Estella play cards for Miss Havisham's amusement, she creepily asks Pip to notice Estella's beauty, almost as if she's taunting him. Estella soon leads Pip to the garden and leaves him. Pip meets a strange, pale young gentleman who wants to fight. The gentleman provokes Pip by headbutting Pip's stomach, and Pip agrees to fight, easily besting the weak but determined young gentleman, who's weirdly cordial the entire time. Finally, they part peacefully. As Estella takes Pip to the gate, she says Pip can kiss her, and he kisses her on the cheek before Estella leads him out. In Chapter 12 of Great Expectations, Pip summarizes his experiences with Miss Havisham and Estella over the next 8 or 10 months. Miss Havisham often has Pip push her in a wheelchair while she asks him questions. She wonders what Pip is learning or what he plans to be. She never pays Pip, but always feeds him dinner, and Estella is often with them. The girl treats Pip inconsistently, sometimes warmly, and sometimes as if she's a stranger. Miss Havisham likes asking Pip if Estella is getting prettier, and Pip says yes. Pip doesn't tell Joe about his experiences at Satis' house, but tells Biddy everything. She listens with deep concern. Meanwhile, Mrs. Joe and Pumblechook often ruminate about Pip's prospects based on Miss Havisham's attentions. Joe remains silent during these talks. One day, at Satis' house, Miss Havisham tells Pip to get her Joe Gargery. In Chapter 13 of Great Expectations, Mrs. Joe, Joe, and Pip walk to Pumblechook's shop, where Mrs. Joe stays, while Joe and Pip continue on to Satis' house. Estella leads them to the dressing room. In this room, Joe meets Miss Havisham, who sits at her dressing table. Joe, so uncomfortable talking to Miss Havisham, answers her questions by addressing Pip. Miss Havisham asks Joe if Pip plans to be his apprentice, and if Pip has any objection to this trade. Joe says that the boy has agreed to be his apprentice, and has not expressed any objection to this. Pip is mortified by Joe's awkwardness. Miss Havisham declares that Pip has earned a premium by coming to her house to play and pays Joe 25 guineas, or pounds. Miss Havisham then tells Joe that he's respectful, and thus not to expect any more money from her. Estella leads Pip and a stunned Joe out of Satis' house. At Pumblechook's place, Joe tells Mrs. Joe and Pumblechook that Miss Havisham has given 25 pounds to Mrs. Joe. Pumblechook pretends he has orchestrated Pip's payment all along. For him, the 25 pounds enables him to display the importance of his social standing. Mrs. Joe is ecstatic because her prospects of reaching a higher social class have improved with this comparatively small sum. Clearly, money represents more than just economic capital to the family. It's all about class mobility, movement, and social standing. They all go to the justices in the town hall, where Pip is bound as an apprentice to Joe. When he gets back to his bedroom, Pip is convinced he will not like Joe's trade. In chapter 14 of Great Expectations, Pip reveals shame he feels about his home, thinking Miss Havisham and Estella would view it as inferior. Pip only works at the forge because of Joe's good example, but the specter of Estella's judgment haunts him when he imagines her seeing him there, filthy and laboring. This makes Pip miserable. Even though Pip once looked forward to being Joe's apprentice, he's now ashamed about this work. Pip feels hopeless considering his future in Joe's trade. Pip believes that he works hard as an apprentice and doesn't run away because of Joe's virtuous example, but he dreads the possibility of Estella coming to the forge, seeing him dirty with soot, and despising him. In chapter 15 of Great Expectations, Pip leaves school after learning as much from Biddy as he can. Pip tutors Joe, secretly hoping to make him more worthy in the eyes of Miss Havisham and Estella. One day, Pip asks Joe if it would be all right for Pip to visit Miss Havisham, really wanting to see Estella. Joe reminds Pip that Miss Havisham said they should not expect any more from her. But when Pip claims he just wants to thank Miss Havisham, Joe allows him to have a half-day holiday. Joe has an assistant named Orlick, a grumbling, crotchety character who dislikes Pip, and he demands that if Pip gets a half-day holiday, he should get one too. Joe reluctantly agrees. Mrs. Joe, listening from the yard, gets upset and calls Joe a fool for granting half holidays. When Orlick calls Mrs. Joe a foul shrew, she flies into a rage. Joe defends his wife, beating up Orlick, but they quickly reconcile over beer shortly thereafter. Pip heads to Satis' house, and Miss Sarah Pocket lets him in instead of Estella. In the dressing room, Pip greets Miss Havisham and thanks her. Miss Havisham tells Pip to visit her on his birthday. She notices Pip looking around for Estella, and she tells him that Estella has gone abroad for her education and is prettier than ever, then dismisses him. Pip feels terrible. Miss Havisham seems to get great delight from lording Estella over Pip as if she's an unattainable prize. Pip, Mr. Wopsle, and Orlick walk to the tavern, where they learn that someone has been attacked at Pip's house. Pip and Orlick run home, where they find a crowd gathered. Mrs. Joe has been knocked down by a tremendous blow on the back of the head. In chapter 16 of Great Expectations, Pip reviews the scene of the assault on his sister. During the evening of the crime, Joe was at the tavern for 2 hours. When he went home, he found Mrs. Joe down on the floor. Mrs. Joe was facing the fire when struck on the back of the head and spine by a blunt object. Nothing was stolen from the house. On the ground beside her, Joe spots a convict's leg iron. The leg iron had been filed, which tells Pip that it was the same one worn by his convict. Pip believes either Orlick or the strange man with the file committed the crime. But Orlick has a strong alibi, having been seen about town during the evening of the assault. After the assault, Mrs. Joe has impaired memory, hearing, and speech, so she has difficulty communicating what she wants. But Pip points out that her temper and patience are greatly improved. After months of frustration at not being able to understand Mrs. Joe, Pip invites Biddy to stay at his house, as Biddy has a knack for understanding what Mrs. Joe is trying to communicate. Eventually, Mrs. Joe shows a desire to be on good terms with Orlick. In chapter 17 of Great Expectations, Pip visits Miss Havisham on his birthday. Miss Pocket lets Pip in. Miss Havisham sits at her dressing table, and she tells Pip the same information about Estella. Miss Havisham pays Pip a guinea for coming and tells him to visit on his next birthday. Pip continues to hate his trade and is ashamed of his home. But he has come to appreciate Biddy's pleasant attitude and her talents for teaching and learning. Pip and Biddy walk on the marsh, and Pip confesses he wants to be a gentleman to gain Estella's approval, or maybe to spite her. Both reasons are problematic. He knows that his infatuation with Estella is foolish, but he can't help himself. Pip confesses to Biddy that he wishes he could fall in love with her. If this happened, Pip knows he would be free from his torturous adoration of Estella. But Biddy tells Pip that he will never fall in love with her. On the way back home, Pip and Biddy meet Orlick, who wants to accompany them. Biddy confesses to Pip that Orlick is romantically interested in her, but she is not into him. An offended Pip decides to keep an eye on Orlick to make sure he doesn't move in on Biddy. In Chapter 18 of Great Expectations, at the tavern, Pip recognizes a man he met on the stairs during his second visit to Miss Havisham's place. The argumentative man tells Pip and Joe that he has some personal business to discuss with them. The man informs Pip and Joe that he is Mr. Jaggers, a lawyer from London. Mr. Jaggers has come to relieve Joe of Pip's services as an apprentice, and then tells Pip that he has great expectations. Mr. Jaggers explains that an anonymous benefactor will make Pip a possessor of property when he becomes an adult. And until then, the benefactor wants Pip to be brought up as a gentleman. But the benefactor has two conditions. First, Pip must always go by the name Pip. Second, the benefactor will be keeping his name secret until the benefactor shall choose to reveal it. A stunned Pip accepts both terms. Mr. Jaggers then tells Pip to view him as a guardian, a service he's being paid for. Pip will be paid money for his education and live as a gentleman. Mr. Jaggers sets Pip up with a tutor in London named Matthew Pocket. Pip recognizes that name as one of Miss Havisham's relatives. Mr. Jaggers leaves Pip money to buy some new clothes. Pip says he will come to London soon, and Mr. Jaggers leaves. Biddy and Joe congratulate Pip on his change of fortune. Biddy tries to communicate the news to Mrs. Joe, who just nods happily. Pip says that when he buys his wardrobe, he doesn't want to display himself in his new clothes for other villagers to admire, which would be a coarse and common business. In Chapter 23 of Great Expectations, Pip meets Mr. Matthew Pocket, his tutor. Pip soon learns that Mrs. Pocket was raised with the expectation of marrying into nobility. She met Mr. Pocket when they were both young, and Mr. Pocket had ambitions of becoming either a member of Parliament or a bishop. So Mrs. Pocket agreed to marry him. Mrs. Pocket is shown here as a ridiculous person with ambitions of becoming nobility that are totally unrealistic. She insists upon being treated as a noble, taking offense to anyone who challenges this delusion. But as things turned out, Mr. Pocket became neither of the things he said he wanted to be, and Mrs. Pocket still acts as if she should be treated like she's a royal. Pip notices that Mr. and Mrs. Pocket allow their servants to run the household with little supervision. Although educated at Harrow and Cambridge, Mr. Pocket had to take a job as a grinder of blades to support his wife. Later, he became a corrector of literary compilations and earned enough, along with some private resources, to support his family. Pip also meets his two fellow students, Bentley Drummle and Startop. Snotty Drummle holds a superior attitude toward everyone. He's in line to become an actual baron, and he lords it over everyone he meets, treating them as inferiors, except Mrs. Pocket, with whom he feels an alliance. Mr. Pocket, perpetually anxious by his wife's obliviousness, pulls at his hair in comic frustration. Mrs. Pocket displays no ability to take care of her children. Also, she gets insulted by servants and children, treating her with disrespect. In Chapter 24 of Great Expectations, Pip is educated not for any profession, but just to be a gentleman. Mr. Pocket's friendly, enthusiastic attitude as a teacher inspires Pip. Pip decides to stay with Herbert at Barnard's Inn and goes to Mr. Jaggers to get money to buy more furniture. After intensive questioning by Jaggers, Pip gets £20 from the lawyer, who leaves. Mr. Wemmick gives Pip a tour of Jaggers' office building, and Pip asks about the two casts hanging on the wall in Jaggers' office. Wemmick explains that each cast was taken of a man after he was hanged for a crime. Jaggers treats his clients like trophies to be won and displayed. Here, he literally has casts of his two most celebrated clients displayed like awards on his wall. After this, the clerk leads Pip to a police court. There, Pip observes Mr. Jaggers dominating the courtroom with his cross-examinations, making everyone cower under his presence, including the judge. In Chapter 25 of Great Expectations, Pip describes Drummle as an unintelligent, sluggish snob who keeps to himself. In contrast, Startop was spoiled by his mother and is devoted to her. Herbert has become a friend and companion of Pip, and the two enjoy long walks and talks together. Mr. and Mrs. Camilla and Georgiana, Mrs. Havisham's relatives, visit Mr. Matthew Pocket's house. Mrs. Camilla is Mr. Pocket's sister, and Georgiana is a cousin. The Camillas and Georgiana fawn over Pip because of his newfound prosperity. Pip does well with his studies, but has developed some expensive habits. One evening after work, Wemmick takes Pip to his home in Walworth for supper. Pip finds that Wemmick's small house resembles a castle. Wemmick has cut out the top of the house to look like a battery with guns, and there's a plank that serves as a drawbridge over a ditch, and an attached small fortress mounted with a cannon, which the clerk fires promptly at 9 o'clock each night. Inside the main house, Wemmick introduces Pip to Wemmick's elderly, nearly deaf father, called the Aged Parent, or Aged P. Aged P seems like an agreeable person who's proud of his son and the house he built, and he enjoys people nodding at him and hearing the cannon go off at 9. Wemmick serves punch to Pip and talks about how the office is one thing and private life is another. It turns out that Mr. Jaggers has never been to Wemmick's castle-like home and knows nothing about it, or the Aged P. The next morning after breakfast, Wemmick takes Pip back to London. During the walk, Pip notices how Wemmick's demeanor seems to harden as they walk along. In chapter 26 of Great Expectations, Pip, Startop, and Drummle go to Mr. Jaggers' office, and after the lawyer thoroughly washes his face and hands after a case, as if cleansing himself of the people or justice system, Jaggers takes the three young men to his home for dinner. Jaggers has a stately but dingy house, and the lawyer himself distributes the food and drinks to his guests, taking a special interest in Drummle. The courses for the dinner are brought in by a tall, pale woman whose face looks as if disturbed by fiery air, who seems to dread Mr. Jaggers' disapproval. Jaggers encourages his guests to talk about themselves, thus revealing their faults. During the conversation, Jaggers grabs the housekeeper's hand and tells her to show his guests her strong wrists. The housekeeper begs Jaggers not to make her do this, but he insists. She then holds out both wrists, which are deeply scarred across. Jaggers casually discusses the strength of her hands before he lets go. Afterward, Pip gets into an argument with Drummle. As the three young men leave the house, Pip goes back and apologizes to Jaggers for saying anything disagreeable that happened during dinner. Jaggers indicates there's no need to apologize, saying he especially likes the spider, referring to Drummle. In chapter 27 of Great Expectations, Pip gets a letter from Biddy announcing that Joe is coming to London to visit Pip. Pip prepares for the visit, worried about how Joe will fit in with Pip's gentlemanly lifestyle. Pip's apartment has changed from its original appearance, being decorated with fine things and having a servant in a uniform. Now Pip says about this servant, "I had made the monster and had clothed him with a blue coat, canary waistcoat, white cravat, creamy breeches. I had to find him a little to do and a great deal to eat. He haunted my existence." So even though Pip can't stand the servant, he puts up with him for appearance's sake. Pip's spending to keep up with these appearances has already put him in debt to an upholsterer. Pip expects Joe to arrive for breakfast and nervously awaits his old friend. He hears a person climbing the stairs and realizes it's Joe by his clumsy gait. Joe and Pip greet each other as old friends, but Pip immediately senses Joe's discomfort. The blacksmith is uncomfortably dressed in a suit and talks in an awkward way, trying to respect Pip as a gentleman. Joe tells Pip that Mr. Wopsle has left the church and become an actor. Herbert enters and greets Joe, who carefully takes off his hat and balances it on the edge of the fireplace mantel. During breakfast, the hat topples, causing Joe to catch it and place it back on the mantel. This routine happens several times until the hat ends up splashing into the slop basin. Pip feels impatient and upset. After breakfast, Herbert leaves. Joe informs Pip that Miss Havisham wants the young man to visit her and Estella, who has come home. Joe then admits he's feeling wrong out of the forge and out of his work clothes and says goodbye to Pip. In chapter 28 of Great Expectations, Pip regrets the way he treated Joe during his visit. Because of this, Pip plans to stay at Joe's home when visiting Miss Havisham. Torn between his snobbishness as a gentleman and his friendship for Joe, Pip gradually convinces himself that such an arrangement would not work well. So he decides to stay at his beloved old tavern, the Blue Boar. On the day of Pip's journey to visit Miss Havisham, he notices two convicts who will be traveling with him. Pip recognizes one of the convicts as the man who gave Pip a shilling wrapped in 2 one-pound notes so long ago. And Pip ends up having to share a carriage with these convicts. Luckily, they don't recognize him. Pip overhears one of the convicts relate a story of how a fellow convict told him to find a boy and give him 2 one-pound notes. When Pip arrives at the Blue Boar, he reads a newspaper article that describes Pumblechook as Pip's earliest patron and the founder of his fortunes. In chapter 29 of Great Expectations, Pip heads to Miss Havisham's, and on the way, he daydreams about Estella being chosen for him and him rescuing her from Satis house. Pip loves Estella, even though he realizes he loves her against reason, hope, and happiness. Pip arrives at Satis house and is surprised when Orlick opens the gate. Orlick's quit his work for Joe and now works as a gatekeeper for Miss Havisham. Pip enters the dressing room, where he sees Miss Havisham seated by her dressing table, as well as an elegant lady. The lady is Estella, who has grown into a beautiful woman. Estella's transformation stuns Pip. She admits that Pip has also changed. Miss Havisham greedily watches the two of them, like a conniving puppet master. Pip and Estella walk in the garden and talk about old times. Pip asks if Estella remembers when she made him cry. She doesn't recall the occasion, which hurts Pip. Then Estella admits she has no heart. She has no sympathy or sentiment, but Pip refuses to believe her. Estella reminds Pip of someone, but he can't put his finger on whom. Estella and Pip walk to the room with the wedding cake covered in cobwebs. Pip pushes Miss Havisham around in her wheelchair. When Estella leaves the room, Miss Havisham repeatedly tells Pip to love Estella. Mr. Jaggers enters, and he and Pip head to a dining room to eat dinner with Estella and Miss Sarah Pocket. Later, an arrangement is made for Estella to travel to London, where Pip will meet her at her coach. Pip and Jaggers leave Satis house. As Pip lies in bed at the Blue Boar, he repeats to himself, as if in a trance, "I love her, I love her, I love her." In chapter 30 of Great Expectations, Pip tells Jaggers that Orlick is not suitable to hold the position of gatekeeper for Miss Havisham. Mr. Jaggers says he'll buy the man off. To avoid bumping into Pumblechook, Pip leaves the Blue Boar after breakfast and walks on the road toward London. The coach will pick him up. When Pip arrives in London, he sends a codfish and a barrel of oysters to Joe to make up for not staying with him. Pip talks to Herbert about his love for Estella. Not surprised, Herbert wonders if Estella feels the same way. Pip laments that Estella remains emotionally distant. Pip also admits to being uncertain about his social position because his expectations are vague. Herbert assures Pip that if Mr. Jaggers is involved with Pip's expectations, he'll receive a healthy fortune. Herbert then reveals his love for a woman named Clara, whom he cannot marry until he begins to earn a healthy income. But Pip confesses he cannot detach himself from the pull of Estella and Miss Havisham. In chapter 31 of Great Expectations, Pip and Herbert attend a performance of Hamlet, in which Mr. Wopsle plays the title role. The performance is so bad that it becomes comic farce. After the play, Pip and Herbert visit Wopsle backstage. With an air of dignity, Mr. Wopsle asks Pip and Herbert about their opinion of his performance, and Herbert prods Pip to give supportive, genial responses. Feeling sorry for Wopsle, Pip invites him to supper. It's clear after the performance that Mr. Wopsle is a person who has a lifelong ambition of being a great stage performer. And although he does become an actor here, Mr. Wopsle is deceiving himself. He has no talent and will never become a great actor. Pip's ambition of marrying Estella and inhabiting an upper-class sphere parallel these self-deceptions. Pip's expectations of a meaningful relationship with Estella is as much of a sham as Wopsle's acting ability. Pip dreams about himself incompetently playing Hamlet to Miss Havisham's ghost. In Chapter 32 of Great Expectations, Pip receives a letter from Estella. The letter confirms Miss Havisham's arrangement for Pip to meet Estella when her coach arrives in London. Anxiously, Pip goes to the coach office hours before the coach is due to arrive. There, he runs into Wemmick, who's on his way to Newgate Prison. Wemmick invites Pip to accompany him and, eager to kill time and distract himself, Pip agrees. The prison is disgusting, disorderly, and an all-around depressing scene. Pip notices Wemmick treat the prisoners like a gardener looking over his plants. When Wemmick sees a newly arrived prisoner, he greets the convict like a shoot that just sprouted during the night. These prisoners are clients of Jaggers, and they recognize Wemmick, asking questions about their cases. However, Wemmick replies that as a subordinate, he can provide no answers and to ask Jaggers. Pip and Wemmick part, and Pip heads back to the coach office. There, he waits for Estella, shaking off the foul dust of the prison he feels is essentially contaminating him as he prepares to meet her. In Chapter 35 of Great Expectations, Pip admits he has no tenderness for Mrs. Joe, but does feel a hint of regret at his sister's death. When Pip arrives at Joe's home, he finds that Mr. Trabb has created an ostentatious, overly showy funeral, making the inside of the house look like a black bazaar, and dressing Joe in a long black cloak with a large bow under his chin. Trabb has tried to create an upper-class funeral, but Pip can tell it's just not working, and the decor just feels weird and out of place. Pip offers his condolences to Joe and notices Biddy trying to help the guests. Pumblechook finds Pip and again fawns over the young man. Mr. Trabb organizes the funeral procession, which Pip feels is like taking part in a morbid dance. The procession heads on to the marsh, to the church where Pip's parents are buried. Afterward, Pip has a simple dinner with Joe and Biddy in the best parlor of Joe's house. Biddy mentions seeing Orlick lurking around, which fills Pip with frustration. Pip states his plan to visit Joe more often, but Biddy wonders if Pip will fulfill this plan. Her doubt hurts Pip. In the morning, Pip says goodbye to Joe and Biddy, and as he walks away, Pip senses that Biddy's doubts are probably justified. In Chapter 36 of Great Expectations, Pip and Herbert continue to pile up debts. On his 21st birthday, Pip comes of age, and it's time to receive his fortune. Pip goes to Jaggers' office, where Wemmick congratulates him. Pip then meets with Jaggers, who asks Pip how much money he's spending. Pip confesses he has no idea, which doesn't surprise Jaggers. Jaggers tells Pip that his benefactor will not be made known today. Then Jaggers hands Pip a banknote for £500. Pip will receive this amount each year, and from now on, will take his money matters into his own hands. Pip is grateful. Jaggers asserts that Pip's benefactor may not reveal their identity for many years, but Pip, as always, still assumes that it's Miss Havisham. Pip invites Jaggers to have dinner with him and Herbert, which the lawyer accepts. Pip then asks Wemmick about the possibility of giving some of his £500 to a friend to help him start in business. Wemmick discourages this idea as a bad investment, but implies that his answer at home in Walworth might be different. Pip gets what he's saying and plans to visit Wemmick at home soon. Pip and Herbert have dinner with Jaggers. In Chapter 37 of Great Expectations, Pip visits Wemmick's house, crossing the drawbridge and entering the castle. The aged P pulls up the drawbridge and informs Pip that Wemmick will be home soon, and soon enough, Wemmick arrives with a woman. Wemmick introduces Pip to Miss Skiffins. Pip learns that Miss Skiffins, a few years younger than Wemmick, often visits the castle. Pip and Wemmick take a walk on the property, and Pip explains his desire to use part of his fortune to anonymously help Herbert get started in business. Pip asks Wemmick if he could think of any way to bring this about, and Wemmick, appreciating Pip's confidence, says he'll think about it. After tea, the aged P reads aloud from a newspaper, with Pip, Wemmick, and Miss Skiffins listening. During the reading, Pip notices Wemmick putting his arm around Miss Skiffins' waist, but she calmly uncoils his arm and places it between her and him in neutral territory. This happens several times. After the aged P dozes off, Pip says his goodbyes. Soon, Wemmick arranges a business deal with a shipping broker who is Miss Skiffins' brother. Pip pays the broker £250, and the broker takes on Herbert as a partner, though Herbert will never be told of Pip's involvement in the matter. Before long, Herbert is overjoyed to find out he has an opportunity with a shipping broker. In Chapter 38 of Great Expectations, Pip often visits Estella at Richmond, where he helplessly watches her romantically ensnare other men. Estella allows Pip to be familiar with her, but gives him no hope that his love for her will ever be returned. All the parties, concerts, and other social events Pip attends with Estella just make him more and more miserable. Pip soon accompanies Estella to Satis' house. Miss Havisham eagerly looks at the beautiful Estella and relishes her painful effect on Pip, seemingly enjoying every moment of it. Pip admits to himself that Miss Havisham uses Estella to seek revenge on men. However, at one point during the visit, Estella pulls away from Miss Havisham and stands by the fireplace. Hurt by this lack of affection, Miss Havisham accuses Estella of being a cold, hard woman. Estella seems amazed by Miss Havisham's accusation, arguing back that she has become what Miss Havisham has made her, a woman who cannot love and who scorns the attentions of men. During the night, Pip hears Miss Havisham pacing and moaning in her room. The following day, Miss Havisham and Estella seem to have made up, except the recluse now regards her ward with a hint of beer. During a dinner at the Finches Club attended by Drummle and Pip, Drummle toasts Estella. Pip is offended by this and accuses Drummle of toasting a woman he doesn't know. But Drummle produces a note written by Estella stating that she has danced with him several times. After a ball, Pip tells Estella he's shocked she would bestow her regard on a brute like Drummle. Estella admits to deceiving and entrapping Drummle and many other men, but not Pip. In Chapter 39 of Great Expectations, 2 years have passed, and Pip is now 23 years old. He and Herbert have moved to nicer rooms, and during a stormy night, Pip reads alone near his fireplace, as Herbert is away on a business trip. A strange man comes to visit Pip, wanting to talk, and extending his muscular arms to the young gentleman in a friendly greeting. Pip fears this man, but out of politeness invites him into his apartment. Pip soon recognizes the man as the convict he helped on the marshes many years before. The man accepts a drink and sits by the fire, revealing that he knows how much money Pip receives each year and that his former guardian was Jaggers. Pip almost faints upon realizing that his former convict, not Miss Havisham, is his benefactor. The man explains how he became a successful sheep farmer, and when he began to make good money, he decided to make Pip into a gentleman and set up the arrangements with Mr. Jaggers. The man expresses pride in Pip's fine clothes and fancy rooms, but confesses that his arrival in England is dangerous. If a convict sent abroad returns to England, he will be arrested if found out. Pip feels abhorrence toward this man for loading him with this wretched gold. On top of the shock, Pip now feels he holds the fate and safety of this man in his hands. Pip lets the man sleep in Herbert's bed. Pip now knows Miss Havisham never intended Estella for him. Instead, she used him for Estella to practice her skills of manipulating, demoralizing, and entrapping men. Terror fills Pip as he realizes he might not be safe having this former convict under his same roof. In chapter 40 of Great Expectations, Pip wakes from a restless sleep, realizing he cannot keep this former convict at his residence because doing so would be too conspicuous. While it's dark, Pip leaves his rooms and stumbles over a man near the staircase, crouching in a corner. The watchman informs Pip that during the night, he let in 2 strangers who appeared to be together. One stranger Pip identifies as his former convict, but the other stranger remains unidentified. Before breakfast, the former convict tells Pip his name is Abel Magwitch, but he goes by Provis. Magwitch says he came alone last night, although he suspected someone might be walking near him. After breakfast, Magwitch says he's planning to stay with Pip. Distraught, Pip decides Magwitch should dress like a prosperous farmer. Magwitch stays in Pip's room, while Pip goes out to rent a room for Magwitch and buy him clothes. Pip then visits Jaggers to verify that Magwitch's story is indeed true. Without admitting any knowledge of Magwitch being in England, Jaggers verifies that the convict had been transported to Australia and had written him from New South Wales. Pip admits he always thought Miss Havisham to be his benefactress. Jaggers takes no responsibility for Pip's misunderstanding. When Herbert returns home, Magwitch makes him swear not to reveal his true identity. In chapter 41 of Great Expectations, Magwitch explains everything to a flabbergasted Herbert. Pip takes Magwitch to the apartment he's rented him, and then returns to his own residence. There, Pip talks to Herbert about what is to be done. A distraught Pip states that he cannot take any more money from Magwitch and wants to disengage himself from the former convict. However, if he does separate himself from Magwitch, Pip fears the former convict will do something rash and get arrested for returning to England. Because of what Magwitch has done for him, Pip does not want him to go back to prison. Herbert suggests that Pip take Magwitch out of the country and then figure out the best way to break from him. Pip agrees that this is a good idea. In chapter 42 of Great Expectations, Magwitch recounts to Pip and Herbert the story of his life. He grew up in poor circumstances, never knowing who his parents were. Many treated young Magwitch as an outcast, and he spent his young adulthood in and out of jail. As an adult, Magwitch took whatever work he could find. Some of it was legal, some wasn't. Eventually, a swindler named Compasson asked Magwitch to become a partner in crime. Hungry and desperate, Magwitch agreed. Compasson had received a decent education and dressed like a gentleman. Compasson and a friend of his named Arthur had once made a fortune swindling a rich lady. Compasson lived a life of crime, assisted by Magwitch, and eventually the pair were arrested. However, the jury became biased against Magwitch because he looked and expressed himself much like a rough, lower-class man, while Compasson carried himself and spoke like a gentleman. Because Compasson denied any direct connection with the crime, the jury sentenced Magwitch to 14 years and Compasson to only 7. An outraged Magwitch swore revenge on Compasson. Magwitch managed to escape the prison hulk onto the marshes, and that's when he met Pip. But when Magwitch learned that Compasson had also escaped, he tracked him down to prevent him from going free. At the end of Magwitch's talk, Herbert writes a note to Pip, stating, young Havisham's name was Arthur. Compasson is the man who professed to be Miss Havisham's lover. That rich lady he'd swindled a fortune out of was, in fact, Miss Havisham. In chapter 43 of Great Expectations, Pip stresses out about Compasson finding out that Magwitch has returned. Pip also realizes that Estella has gone to Satis' house without him, which feels unusual. Pip makes arrangements for Herbert to look after Magwitch and then takes a coach to his home village, where he plans to visit Satis' house. Back at the Blue Boar, Pip sees Drummle. Pip orders breakfast and gets annoyed at Drummle standing in front of the fireplace, blocking all the heat. Pip positions himself side by side with Drummle so that both men stand stubbornly before the fire, even though Drummle's breakfast has been cleared and Pip's breakfast has just been brought. Drummle tells a servant that the lady won't go riding today, and he is to dine with the lady. Drummel's reference to the lady cuts Pip to the heart. 3 farmers come toward the fireplace, forcing Pip and Drummel to relinquish their positions. Drummel gets on a horse and rides away, and Pip decides he feels too out of sorts to eat much breakfast and heads to Satis' house. In chapter 44 of Great Expectations, Pip visits Miss Havisham and Estella in the dressing room of Satis' house. Pip confronts Miss Havisham about letting him think she was his benefactress. Miss Havisham admits to doing this willingly and becomes angry when Pip asks her if leading him on was a kind thing to do. Pip says she also misled the Pockets, Georgiana, and the Camillas. Miss Havisham becomes defensive about this, saying her relatives and Pip made their own snares. Pip reminds her that Mr. Pocket and Herbert are not self-seeking and should not be lumped in with her other relatives. Miss Havisham wonders what Pip wants her to do for the 2 of them. Pip then declares his love for Estella, who seems unmoved, and reminds Pip that she warned him about her not having a heart. Pip goes further, saying he suspects Miss Havisham wants Estella to marry Drummel. Estella admits she is going to marry Drummel, but says Miss Havisham has nothing to do with that decision. Appalled, Pip begs her to reconsider. Estella remains firm with her decision and says Pip will forget about her in a week. Pip pours his heart out to Estella, saying she is part of his existence, part of himself. Miss Havisham seems to show some pity and remorse as she gazes upon Pip and Estella. Devastated, Pip leaves and heads directly back to London. When he arrives, the night porter gives Pip a note from Wemmick that tells Pip not to go home. In chapter 45 of Great Expectations, Pip goes to a hotel in Covent Garden, where he spends a restless night wondering why he shouldn't go home and if Magwitch is safe. The next day, Pip goes to Wemmick's castle, where he finds Wemmick preparing breakfast for the aged P. Without naming names, Wemmick implies that a convict left Australia, and theories had been raised about where he went. He also warns Pip he is being watched. Pip asks Wemmick if he ever heard of Compasson, if this person is alive, and if so, is he living in London? Wemmick nods his head yes in response to each question. Without referring to Magwitch by name, Wemmick says Herbert decided to hide Magwitch in the house of his fiancée, Clara, in a secluded part of London. Wemmick suggests that Pip eventually board Magwitch on a foreign packet boat. Wemmick gives Pip the address of Herbert's fiancée and then leaves for work. In chapter 46 of Great Expectations, Pip arrives at Clara's house, where Herbert greets him. Herbert introduces Pip to Clara, a very pretty girl with a modest demeanor. She and Herbert seem deeply smitten with each other. Herbert takes Pip to Magwitch's room, where the former convict is comfortably lodged. Pip tells Magwitch he's under suspicion and being watched. Herbert then relates a plan for getting Pip and Magwitch out of the country. Pip could develop the routine of rowing a boat on the Thames. As Pip rows past Magwitch's hideaway, Magwitch could lower the shade of his window as a sign that all is well. Eventually, Pip could include Magwitch in the boat. People would be used to seeing Pip rowing and would not take note of an extra passenger. Pip and Magwitch would wait in the rowboat for a foreign packet boat to pick them up. Pip and Magwitch agree to this plan. Pip heads home and soon enough implements the routine of rowing, but he cannot shake the fear of being watched. In chapter 47 of Great Expectations, Pip avoids reading the newspaper because he's not ready for the news that Estella has married Drummel. He remains anxious about Magwitch, but can do nothing about this except continue to row his boat at regular intervals, as per his plan. After a rowing excursion, Pip attends a play in which Mr. Wopsle is an actor. When the play is over, Wopsle meets Pip and admits seeing him during the performance. But Wopsle also saw another person seated behind Pip, who looked suspiciously like the convict on the marshes with the bruised left cheek all those years ago. Pip feels terror at the prospect of Compasson shadowing him. Pip leaves Mr. Wopsle, goes home, and relates to Herbert the frightening news. Pip and Herbert agree that they can do nothing about Compeyson except to tell Wemmick about him and be especially cautious. In chapter 48 of Great Expectations, Mr. Jaggers meets Pip as he walks home and invites him to dinner, which Wemmick has also been invited to. At the dinner, Wemmick gives Pip a note from Miss Havisham, which asks Pip to see her. Jaggers says that Drummle has won the pool. Pip realizes Jaggers is referring to Drummle's marriage to Estella. Jaggers says he's not sure who will win with the marriage, because Estella is more intelligent, she'll win, unless Drummle beats her. The possibility that Drummle might beat Estella torments Pip. When the housekeeper Molly serves food, Pip notices a strange similarity of her eyes and hands to the eyes and hands of Estella. He suddenly realizes Molly is Estella's mother, but he says nothing about it. As Pip and Wemmick walk away from Jaggers' place, Pip asks him what he knows about Molly. Early in his career, Jaggers defended Molly on the charge of murdering a woman out of jealousy, and Jaggers cleverly convinced the jury to acquit Molly. Since then, she's been his servant, one who acts like a tamed beast. Molly indeed had a daughter who disappeared. Pip realizes that because Mr. Jaggers defended Molly and is also the lawyer for Miss Havisham, he must have arranged for the daughter to be adopted by the recluse. But why? In chapter 49 of Great Expectations, Pip returns to Satis house and visits Miss Havisham in the room with the decaying wedding cake. Miss Havisham asks Pip to explain how she could complete an act he had started to help Herbert, and Pip notices that Miss Havisham seems to regard him with fear. Pip explains how she can anonymously assist Herbert. Miss Havisham tells Pip to consider his request completed, and asks if she can do anything more directly to help him. Pip says he wants nothing more. Miss Havisham writes on a tablet directions for Jaggers to provide the necessary funds to complete Herbert's business arrangements. Miss Havisham asks Pip to forgive her, hopefully someday, and Pip says he can do it now. Miss Havisham falls to her knees before Pip and raises her folded hands to him. She then slumps to the floor, crying in despair, "What have I done? What have I done?" Pip assures Miss Havisham that he would have fallen in love with Estella under any circumstances. However, he says if she could somehow undo some of the harm she's done to Estella, to please do so. Consumed by remorse, Miss Havisham explains that she at first wanted to save Estella from having her heart broken and nothing more. But as Estella became more beautiful, Miss Havisham stole her heart away and put ice in its place. Miss Havisham has no idea who Estella's natural parents are. She told Jaggers she wanted a child to raise in love, and the lawyer gave her a 2 or 3-year-old child named Estella. Pip knows that Molly is Estella's mother. Pip takes a walk around the garden and the brewery, remembering the times he spent with Estella. When he returns to the large room, he sees a burst of flame where Miss Havisham sits, and she rushes toward Pip with her dress on fire. Pip puts out the flames with his coat, and the doctor arrives and lays Miss Havisham on the long table at the spot where she said she would lie when dead. The doctor asserts that shock has done more harm to Miss Havisham than the flames. Pip notices that his own hands have been burned. As she lies on the table, Miss Havisham laments over what she's done, how she at first wanted to love Estella, and for Pip to please forgive her. In chapter 50 of Great Expectations, Herbert carefully changes the bandages on Pip's burned hands and arms while explaining that Magwitch had relations with a woman who ended up murdering another woman in a jealous rage. Then Magwitch's woman threatened to destroy their child. Magwitch loved this child. Therefore, during the trial, Magwitch kept a low profile for fear he would be called to testify, and as a result, cause his child to be destroyed. Jaggers got the woman acquitted. Soon afterward, the child and woman disappeared. After Herbert relates this story, Pip tells him that Magwitch is Estella's mother. In Chapter 51 of Great Expectations, Pip, with his arm in a sling, heads to Mr. Jaggers' office and interrupts Jaggers and Wemmick as they're checking off vouchers. Pip tells them about the tragic accident at Satis House, in which he and Miss Havisham were burned. Pip hands Jaggers the tablets, which convey Miss Havisham's instructions about paying £900 to help Herbert in his business, and Jaggers writes out the check. Pip then reveals that he knows the identity of Estella's parents. Because Jaggers himself does not know who Estella's father is, this news comes as a surprise. Then Pip explains how he learned this information without mentioning Wemmick's involvement in the matter. Pip asks Jaggers to explain how Estella came to be adopted by Miss Havisham. Jaggers explains that he knew a woman charged with murder who had a child and also knew that Miss Havisham wanted to adopt a daughter. Jaggers told the woman he would try to get her acquitted only if she offered her daughter up for adoption. Jaggers did this because he'd seen hundreds of poor children raised in harsh conditions that made it more likely they would lead difficult lives and become criminals. The woman agreed to the terms, and Jaggers got her acquitted. Jaggers asks Pip what purpose would it serve to tell Estella's mother and father about their child. Also, Jaggers wonders how Estella would benefit by knowing the identity of her parents. In fact, Pip thinks such news would bring Estella disgrace. In Chapter 52 of Great Expectations, Pip gives the check for £900 to Herbert's boss, securing Herbert as a partner in his business. By that March, Pip's right arm and hand have mostly healed, but his left arm remains in a sling. Herbert and Pip receive a note from Wemmick suggesting that Pip should leave with Magwitch via a foreign packet boat the following Wednesday. But because of Pip's injury, he is unable to help row the rowboat to come meet the packet. As a result, Herbert and Pip ask their friend Startop to row, without telling him about any details of their mission. But Startop happily agrees. Pip gets another note, telling him to come alone to the little sluice house by the lime kiln on the marshes if he wants information about Magwitch. Perplexed by this mysterious note, Pip decides to go, fearing that ignoring it might bring harm to Magwitch. Pip goes to his home village and stays at an inn. While there, he learns that Pumblechook has once again falsely claimed credit for making Pip rich. In Chapter 53 of Great Expectations, Pip heads onto the marshes to the lime kiln, where he finds the old sluice house. When Pip knocks at the door, he doesn't hear a response, and he enters, but he's attacked from behind by Orlick, who binds Pip with a rope to a ladder. A drunken Orlick triumphantly claims, "I've got you." Subdued and in pain, Pip asks why Orlick has attacked him. Orlick explains he's getting back at Pip for getting him fired from his position at Miss Havisham's and for coming between him and Biddy. He confesses that it was he who hit Mrs. Joe from behind all those years ago, leading to her eventual death. But he blames Pip's being favored over him for that too. Orlick declares he's gonna kill Pip by knocking him unconscious and sticking him in the lime kiln. Orlick goes on to say he has learned about Pip trying to get Magwitch out of the country. Orlick lifts up a stone hammer, but suddenly several people attack Orlick, who then flees. Herbert, Startop, and Trab's boy have come to the rescue. Pip had accidentally left Orlick's note at his residence, and Herbert read it. He and Startop went to Pip's village, and with the help of Trab's boy, tracked Pip down. Herbert and Startop take Pip back to London, where Pip recovers from his ordeal. In Chapter 54 of Great Expectations, Pip, Herbert, and Startop board their rowboat, and with Herbert and Startop rowing and Pip guiding the rudder, head toward Clara's house. When they arrive, Magwitch climbs aboard, expressing his gratitude to Pip for seeing him out of the country. The four of them head down the Thames, out of London, to a remote public house. There, they eat dinner and stay the night. In the morning, Pip and his three friends get in their rowboat and head out into the track of the expected foreign packet boat. As the packet, powered by steam, approaches, a four-oared galley shoots into the packet's track. The galley approaches alongside Pip's boat, and an officer in it orders the convict to be handed over. Meanwhile, the packet steamer has reached the galley and Pip's boat, and to avoid hitting them, stops its paddles. The officer grabs Magwitch, who lunges at a person with a cloaked face in the galley. Magwitch pulls the cloak away, revealing Compasson. Clutched in each other's arms, Magwitch and Compasson fall overboard. The packet steamer continues on. Magwitch swims toward the galley and is taken on board. Compasson has drowned. Magwitch is immediately manacled at the wrists and ankles. He has been seriously injured by the paddles of the steamer. Pip sadly knows that Magwitch will not be treated leniently by a jury. In Chapter 55 of Great Expectations, Pip tells Mr. Jaggers not to let Magwitch know that his fortune will not be inherited by Pip, but instead will be forfeited to the government. And since Pip has no legal tie to Magwitch, the young man can make no claim to Magwitch's funds and property. At Pip's residence, Herbert tells Pip he has to leave soon for Cairo on business. Herbert asks if Pip would consider taking a position as a clerk at the Cairo office, with the possibility of one day becoming a partner. Pip thanks Herbert for the offer and says he'll consider it. Near his residence, Pip encounters Wemmick, who asks Pip to accompany him on a walk next Monday morning. Pip agrees. When Pip arrives at Wemmick's castle, he meets Wemmick and they go for the walk, with Wemmick carrying a fishing rod. Pip views this as odd because they're not going fishing, but he says nothing. As if by chance, Wemmick and Pip make their way to a church and go inside. There, Wemmick puts down the fishing rod and puts on a pair of white gloves. Pip then notices the aged P leading Miss Skiffins, also wearing white gloves, to the altar. Wemmick and Miss Skiffins get married, with Pip serving as the best man. After the ceremony, on the way out of the church, Wemmick picks up the fishing rod and tells Pip, "Let me ask you whether anybody would suppose this to be a wedding party." After breakfast, Wemmick asks Pip not to let Jaggers know about the marriage, and Pip assures him he won't. In Chapter 56 of Great Expectations, a very ill Magwitch is moved from the prison house to the infirmary, where he awaits trial. Pip visits him on a regular basis and watches Magwitch become progressively weaker. During the trial, Magwitch sits at the front of the dock, and Pip sits near him outside the dock and holds his hand. Magwitch is found guilty and sentenced to death. Pip writes petitions to officials asking for a reprieve, but he expects none. Pip makes daily visits to Magwitch in the infirmary, where the convicted man waits for his execution. Magwitch's health continues to deteriorate, but he expresses his gratitude to Pip for staying by him. One day, sensing that Magwitch is about to die, Pip tells him that his daughter lives and is a beautiful lady, and that he loves her. Unable to talk, Magwitch kisses Pip's hand and then dies. In Chapter 57 of Great Expectations, Pip reveals he has accrued large debts, and he also becomes so ill that he is unable to leave his bed. Things get worse when officials visit him to arrest him because of his debts. However, realizing that Pip cannot be moved, they delay his arrest. Pip falls into a feverish delirium, during which he sees the face of Joe. Pip gains enough consciousness to realize that Joe has, in fact, been nursing him during his illness. Joe seems overjoyed that Pip's fever is broken and continues to nurse Pip as he gradually gains strength, though Pip feels terribly guilty. During Pip's recovery, Joe tells Pip about Miss Havisham's death. The crazy old recluse left most of her wealth to Estella, but also left 4,000 pounds to Mr. Matthew Pocket. Pip is pleased to hear this. Joe relates how Orlick and some of his friends broke into Pumblechook's shop and harassed the seed merchant, and that Orlick was arrested. Pip refrains from telling Joe about his debts and how he no longer has a fortune. He resolves to reveal everything to Joe, but the next morning, Pip sees a note from Joe stating that he doesn't want to intrude on gentlemanly Pip now that his friend is well. Pip sees a receipt for his debts and realizes that Joe has paid them. Pip decides to go to Joe's forge, where he will apologize to Joe for the way he's treated him. Then, Pip decides he'll ask Biddy to marry him. In Chapter 58 of Great Expectations, Pip goes to his hometown and stays at the Blue Boar, where the employees have heard of Pip's reversal of fortune. The next morning, Pip walks to Satis' house and learns that the building and its furniture are to be auctioned. Pip eats breakfast at the Blue Boar, Pumblechook accuses Pip of being ungrateful about his totally unrealistic role in securing Pip's fortune. Pip heads for Joe's forge with the intention of asking Biddy to marry him. But the forge is closed, and the entrance to Joe's house is decorated with flowers. Joe and Biddy have just been married. They appear arm in arm and are ecstatic to see Pip. Pip is delighted by this news and relieved that he didn't tell Joe about his intention to marry Biddy. Pip wishes the couple well and asks for their forgiveness concerning the way he treated them. Joe and Pip mend their friendship, and Pip shares a meal with his two friends and then says goodbye, sells all his belongings, and uses the proceeds to pay back the money Joe supplied for Pip's debts. Pip goes to work for Herbert's company, Clarriker and Company. Soon, Clara's father dies, allowing Clara and Herbert to marry. After many years, Pip becomes a third partner at Clarriker. Eventually, the senior partner reveals to Herbert Pip's role in securing Herbert's partnership. This news amazes and moves Herbert. The three partners of Clarriker and Company have moderate success with their business. The final chapter of Great Expectations, Chapter 59, begins with Pip, who's been working for 11 years at Clarriker's, visiting Joe and Biddy at their home. Pip meets little Pip, Joe and Biddy's son. Joe says he and his wife hope that little Pip will grow up to be just like the adult Pip. Pip takes little Pip on a walk to the cemetery on the marsh. Later, Pip talks with Biddy with her little girl on her lap. Biddy tells Pip that he must marry. Pip doubts if he ever will. Now, it's important to note beyond the text that a friend convinced Charles Dickens to replace his original ending with the following ending. Pip confesses to Biddy that he's not forgotten about Estella, but his dream of marrying her has all gone by. Pip has heard that Drummle had abused Estella. 2 years earlier, Drummle died from a horse accident. Pip walks to Satis' house and finds that the buildings have been torn down and all that remains is the old garden wall. In the evening mist, Pip sees a figure walking through the former garden, and he realizes the figure is Estella. They greet each other. Estella says she has never been here since she left to get married. Pip hasn't returned either until now. Tears drop from Estella's eyes. Estella explains that the ground they now walk on is the only possession she has left. Pip says he works hard and earns a sufficient living. Estella admits she has lately often thought of Pip and has given him a place in her heart. Pip replies that Estella has always had a place in his heart. Estella asks for Pip's forgiveness and hopes they can be friends. Pip says, "We are friends." Pip takes Estella's hand and they leave the ruined place. Pip says, "I saw no shadow of another parting from her." However, Dickens's original ending, which is generally unpublished, is this. 2 years after Pip visits Joe and Biddy, Pip walks with little Pip in London. Pip has heard that Drummle had abused Estella. After Drummle died from a horse accident, Estella married the doctor who had treated Drummle. The doctor had previously witnessed Drummle's abuse of his wife and tried to stop it. Pip and little Pip bump into Estella by chance, who is driving a pony carriage. Pip and Estella exchange sad looks and shake hands. Estella says she has changed and, mistaking the child for his son, asks to kiss little Pip. Pip lifts the boy to her and she kisses him. Later, Pip feels glad he had this chance meeting with Estella because he could tell from her voice and her touch that suffering had been stronger than Miss Havisham's teaching and had given her heart to understand what my heart used to be. This ending implies that Estella now disregards social class and ambition and has attained a type of redemption. Pip's great expectations of wealth and marrying Estella have disappeared, but in their place, he has gained a more mature and compassionate heart. Emotionally evocative symbols, chief among them tears, the Satis house, and money itself, occur repeatedly throughout Great Expectations. Charles Dickens uses tears to represent passionate emotions, like gratefulness, love, and shame. In Great Expectations, tears have a benevolent, clarifying effect. When Pip cries, he feels better afterward. After Pip cries tears of shame from Estella's insults, he is able to continue in his daily life. When Pip cries tears of remorse about his treatment of Joe, he can more fully sense how wrongly he treated his friend. The only tears that do not have a positive effect are the crocodile tears shed by Mrs. Camilla, because they represent false emotions. Another important symbol is the Saddest House. The Saddest House represents a lack of growth or death. Miss Havisham's hateful and bitter attitude creates a structure in which time seems to stand still, literally, as all the clocks have stopped at the time her wedding was to have taken place. Nothing significant changes in Saddest House. The furniture remains in the same position without being dusted for years. The wedding cake remains on the table, covered in cobwebs. Miss Havisham has created her own mausoleum that will house her corpse. Satis is Latin for enough. The title could be ironic. Estella suggests the term satis implies that a person who owns this house has enough of everything. However, Miss Havisham doesn't have enough love. In fact, she does not have enough of anything except money and bitterness. Money is another key symbol. In Great Expectations, money represents the value that society places on someone. Many characters value themselves and their own personal worth as human beings around their economic, money-possessing value. Charles Dickens uses money in the novel to represent power or control over people. For example, Miss Havisham uses money like a puppet master to make Estella do exactly what the recluse wants her to do in London. Also, Magwitch uses money to control Pip and make him into what Magwitch wants, namely, a gentleman. But Miss Havisham and Magwitch's use of money to control people backfires. Estella becomes cold toward Miss Havisham. Pip becomes miserable as a gentleman, but doesn't tell this to Magwitch, instead wishing he'd never come and he'd never become a gentleman in the first place. Great Expectations is underscored by some important duality-driven themes: social class and ambition, guilt and redemption, and uncertainty and deceit. From the lower classes to the upper classes, Great Expectations can be seen as an exploration of social class and ambition. In Victorian England, members of the lower class and middle classes often had the ambition to rise up to a higher class. In contrast, members of the upper class wanted to maintain their superiority and use it to control other people for their own ends. Magwitch, the main representative of the lower classes, was born into poverty, and because of these circumstances, fell into a life of crime. Dickens shows that some lower-class people become caught in a trap of poverty that makes it difficult for them to improve their lives. Magwitch realizes he will never become a gentleman, but he has ambitions to make Pip a gentleman, and thereby attain upper-class status. Because of the influence of the upper-class Miss Havisham, Pip comes to view being a blacksmith as inferior work, and he has the ambition to become a gentleman, hoping to receive the approval of Miss Havisham and her daughter Estella, and thereby validate himself as a human being. His ambition is to win Estella's approval, but for Miss Havisham, her ambition is to have Estella break the hearts of men. Guilt and redemption is a theme that drives Pip, whether helping a convict, wanting to rise in social station, or becoming a gentleman. Pip is plagued by guilt throughout the novel, too. Pip feels guilt in how his snobbish rise in status makes him look down on Joe, but by the novel's end, he mends his friendship and is redeemed. Pip thinks he can attain redemption only when his dream of marrying Estella and gaining Miss Havisham's approval happens, but this vision crumbles. Eventually, Pip realizes he can gain self-worth not by becoming a gentleman, but rather by working for it. As a result, he works for many years as Herbert's business partner, redeeming himself. For most of the novel, Miss Havisham shows no guilt, but she realizes that she has trained Estella to not only break the hearts of men, but break her own heart. Because of this, she asks for Pip's forgiveness. Consumed by feelings of guilt, Miss Havisham is unable to grasp redemption through accepting Pip's forgiveness. Dickens starts the novel with uncertainty and deceit. Pip is uncertain about what his parents look like, then uncertain about the convicts. This uncertainty leads to his deceitful act of stealing food in a file. Pip's uncertainty about his benefactor is in part caused by Miss Havisham's deceit about being Pip's benefactor. Pip becomes involved in the deceitful act of trying to sneak Magwitch out of the country, while feeling uncertain whether Compeyson is following him. But Dickens shows how removing deceit can also eliminate uncertainty. For example, Pip feels uncertain about the identity of Molly, Mr. Jaggers' housekeeper. But Pip becomes surer of her identity as he learns about Mr. Jaggers' deceitful act of secretly giving Estella to Miss Havisham to raise as her adopted daughter. Estella, it turns out, is the daughter of Molly and Magwitch. In the introduction of Great Expectations, 7-year-old Pip, the protagonist, looks over the graves of his parents in a cemetery on the marshes, where he meets an escaped convict who terrifies Pip and orders the boy to bring him food in a file. Pip lives with his older sister, Mrs. Joe, and her husband, Joe, a blacksmith. Pip aids the convict, and the following day Pip and Joe tag along with soldiers searching for 2 missing convicts, Magwitch and Compeyson, who were rearrested. A wealthy, reclusive woman named Miss Havisham sends for Pip to visit her. Miss Havisham is decrepit-looking, wearing a faded wedding dress. Pip plays cards with Estella, Havisham's adopted daughter, who insults him. During the rising action, Pip then begins to visit Miss Havisham on a regular basis. Pip becomes infatuated with Estella, but sees himself as her inferior. Pip becomes Joe's apprentice, but is ashamed of his work. One day, Miss Havisham tells Pip that his services are no longer required. Pip develops a desire to become a gentleman. Attacked by an unidentified assailant, Mrs. Joe loses her ability to speak. A young woman named Biddy comes to nurse Mrs. Joe. After several years, a visiting lawyer named Mr. Jaggers tells Joe and Pip that an anonymous benefactor wants to pay for Pip to be educated as a gentleman. Pip assumes it's Miss Havisham. Pip heads to London and stays with a young man named Herbert Pocket, who explains how Miss Havisham was jilted by her lover on her wedding day and has since remained a recluse. Pip is tutored by Matthew Pocket, Herbert's father. Pip becomes friends with Jaggers' clerk, Wemmick. Pip acts and lives like a gentleman, uncomfortable about the crude-mannered Joe visiting him. Pip again visits Miss Havisham and sees Estella, who is now a beautiful lady. Mrs. Joe dies, and Pip briefly returns to attend the funeral at Joe's house. On Pip's 21st birthday, Mr. Jaggers tells Pip he will now receive the funds his anonymous benefactor promised. 2 years later, Magwitch tells a shocked Pip that he is Pip's benefactor. Feeling he owes Magwitch a great deal, but also ashamed of him, Pip plans to leave the country with him. Visiting Miss Havisham and Estella, Pip realizes that Estella plans to marry the brutish Bentley Drummle, which breaks his heart. Estella marries Drummle, and Pip learns Magwitch is her father. Pip visits Miss Havisham, who begs Pip to forgive her. After this plea, Miss Havisham's dress catches fire, and Pip puts out the flames. In the climax of the novel, Pip and Magwitch attempt to flee the country in a boat, but fail when they're intercepted by a boat containing authorities and Compeyson. Magwitch is severely injured. Because Magwitch has no official heirs, his fortune does not go to Pip, but instead goes to the government. During the falling action, Pip tells Magwitch that his daughter is alive and that Pip loves her. Grateful to hear this news, Magwitch dies. Pip falls ill and is nursed back to health by Joe. Pip visits Joe at his home and realizes that it's on Joe and Biddy's wedding day. Pip renews his friendship with Joe. In the resolution, Pip and Estella show signs of getting together. But in Dickens's original ending, Pip and Estella reconcile, but then part. There are essentially 5 main characters in Great Expectations. The first is Pip. Philip Pirrip, or Pip, is the protagonist of Great Expectations. As a boy, he seems unsure of his own self-worth and place in the world. His parents are dead, and he's been raised by his bad-tempered sister, Mrs. Joe, and her husband, a blacksmith named Joe. Mrs. Joe often beats Pip and tells him she wishes he was never born. As a result, Pip has a sense of inferiority. Fortunately, Joe befriends Pip and tries to protect him as much as possible. Because of this, Pip forms a strong bond with the simple, kind Joe and looks forward to being his apprentice. However, Miss Havisham and her adopted daughter Estella trigger Pip's sense of inferiority. Under her influence, Pip comes to view being a blacksmith's apprentice as common. To attain validation as a person, Pip believes he must rise to the upper class, transforming himself to win over Estella, an opportunity granted to him by a mysterious benefactor. Then there's Estella. Estella is the adopted daughter of the recluse, Miss Havisham. She is groomed by Miss Havisham to become an instrument of the jilted recluse's vengeance. Under Miss Havisham's influence, Estella suppresses her natural desire for love and to express it. As a result, her own heart has grown cold. She marries an abusive brute, Bentley Drummle. Miss Havisham is another key character. Miss Havisham comes from a wealthy family that gained a fortune through a brewery. As a young woman, Miss Havisham developed into a proud, headstrong person. She became engaged to a man even though relatives warned her against it. When the man jilted Miss Havisham on her wedding day, he deeply wounded her. Miss Havisham became a recluse for whom time stopped on her wedding day. She lives in a state of frozen time in her home, Saddis House, wearing her wedding dress and withering away. Abel Magwitch is another important character. An escaped convict who tells young Pip to get food and a file for him, Magwitch at first appears to be a terrifying hardened criminal who hates another convict named Compasson. An early indication that more lies beneath Magwitch comes when he takes responsibility for stealing food even though Pip actually stole it for him. Later, Pip learns about Magwitch's hard life growing up in poverty without parents, and then his life as a transported convict in Australia. Magwitch is Pip's secret benefactor who bankrolls Pip's training to become a gentleman. Then there's Joe Gargery. Joe Gargery is a blacksmith who befriends his wife's younger brother, Pip. Joe is a simple, kind man who accepts his life and wants nothing more. Joe values hard work, honesty, and friendship. He has respect and integrity. Joe acts awkwardly toward Pip after he becomes a gentleman. He eventually marries Biddy, Pip's former friend and tutor, and rekindles his friendship with Pip. Emotionally evocative symbols, chief among them tears, the Saddis House, and money itself, occur repeatedly throughout Great Expectations. Charles Dickens uses tears to represent passionate emotions, like gratefulness, love, and shame. In Great Expectations, tears have a benevolent, clarifying effect. When Pip cries, he feels better afterward. After Pip cries tears of shame from Estella's insults, he is able to continue in his daily life. When Pip cries tears of remorse about his treatment of Joe, he can more fully sense how wrongly he treated his friend. The only tears that do not have a positive effect are the crocodile tears shed by Mrs. Camilla, because they represent false emotions. Another important symbol is the Saddis House. The Saddis House represents a lack of growth or death. Miss Havisham's hateful and bitter attitude creates a structure in which time seems to stand still, literally, as all the clocks have stopped at the time her wedding was to have taken place. Nothing significant changes in Saddis House. The furniture remains in the same position without being dusted for years. The wedding cake remains on the table, covered in cobwebs. Miss Havisham has created her own mausoleum that will house her corpse. Saddis is Latin for enough. The title could be ironic. Estella suggests the term saddis implies that a person who owns this house has enough of everything. However, Miss Havisham doesn't have enough love. In fact, she does not have enough of anything except money and bitterness. Money is another key symbol. In Great Expectations, money represents the value that society places on someone. Many characters value themselves and their own personal worth as human beings around their economic, money-possessing value. Charles Dickens uses money in the novel to represent power or control over people. For example, Miss Havisham uses money like a puppet master to make Estella do exactly what the recluse wants her to do in London. Also, Magwitch uses money to control Pip and make him into what Magwitch wants, namely a gentleman. But Miss Havisham and Magwitch's use of money to control people backfires. Estella becomes cold toward Miss Havisham. Pip becomes miserable as a gentleman, but doesn't tell this to Magwitch, instead wishing he'd never come and he'd never become a gentleman in the first place. Great Expectations is underscored by some important duality-driven themes: social class and ambition, guilt and redemption, and uncertainty and deceit. From the lower classes to the upper classes, Great Expectations can be seen as an exploration of social class and ambition. In Victorian England, members of the lower class and middle classes often had the ambition to rise up to a higher class. In contrast, members of the upper class wanted to maintain their superiority and use it to control other people for their own ends. Magwitch, the main representative of the lower classes, was born into poverty, and because of these circumstances, fell into a life of crime. Dickens shows that some lower class people become caught in a trap of poverty that makes it difficult for them to improve their lives. Magwitch realizes he will never become a gentleman, but he has ambitions to make Pip a gentleman, and thereby attain upper class status. Because of the influence of the upper class Miss Havisham, Pip comes to view being a blacksmith as inferior work, and he has the ambition to become a gentleman, hoping to receive the approval of Miss Havisham and her daughter Estella, and thereby validate himself as a human being. His ambition is to win Estella's approval, but for Miss Havisham, her ambition is to have Estella break the hearts of men. Guilt and redemption is a theme that drives Pip, whether helping a convict, wanting to rise in social station, or becoming a gentleman. Pip is plagued by guilt throughout the novel, too. Pip feels guilt in how his snobbish rise in status makes him look down on Joe, but by the novel's end, he mends his friendship and is redeemed. Pip thinks he can attain redemption only when his dream of marrying Estella and gaining Miss Havisham's approval happens, but this vision crumbles. Eventually, Pip realizes he can gain self-worth not by becoming a gentleman, but rather by working for it. As a result, he works for many years as Herbert's business partner, redeeming himself. For most of the novel, Miss Havisham shows no guilt, but she realizes that she has trained Estella to not only break the hearts of men, but break her own heart. Because of this, she asks for Pip's forgiveness. Consumed by feelings of guilt, Miss Havisham is unable to grasp redemption through accepting Pip's forgiveness. Dickens starts the novel with uncertainty and deceit. Pip is uncertain about what his parents look like, then uncertain about the convicts. This uncertainty leads to his deceitful act of stealing food in a file. Pip's uncertainty about his benefactor is in part caused by Miss Havisham's deceit about being Pip's benefactor. Pip becomes involved in the deceitful act of trying to sneak Magwitch out of the country, while feeling uncertain whether Compeyson is following him. But Dickens shows how removing deceit can also eliminate uncertainty. For example, Pip feels uncertain about the identity of Molly, Mr. Jaggers' housekeeper. But Pip becomes surer of her identity as he learns about Mr. Jaggers' deceitful act of secretly giving Estella to Miss Havisham to raise as her adopted daughter. Estella, it turns out, is the daughter of Molly and Magwitch.